won't be a long meeting, so I'm very grateful for all of you for signing in. How you doing, Sarah?
Doing good.
Okay.
How are you doing?
I'm doing fine. Just, you know, just have no trust for any public official from the top down.
Does that include us?
No, no.
We're appointed, we're not elected.
I'm a public member, so I'm not even official.
That's right. No, it's a bad situation. The neighborhood's not doing well.
Yeah, you're aware of what's going on 36 right now, I'm sure.
What's going on, Brian?
Well, you know that DHS has moved over 515 shelter residents in to the two of the hotels on West 36th Street, and it has overwhelmed the neighborhood.
Yeah.
Considering, you know, we already have substantial supportive housing and
Yeah.
social services, and so our block has descended into complete chaos, and it's spread out onto 8th and 9th, unfortunately.
Terrible.
Yeah.
2 hotels on 48th, same thing. It's just
51st Street as well.
But the police are doing a great job of protecting their precinct buildings.
that's not funny.
No.
Brian, can you share which hotels they're in?
Yes, they're in the Doubletree Hilton, which is on West 36 between 8th and 9th Avenue. And they're in the Marriott Hotel, also on 36th Street between 8th and 9th Avenue. That was the former Christ Church that we worked on preserving the facade in. And, you know, part of the issue is that Hell's Kitchen, from my understanding, has received 2,100 shelter individuals from outside of our district being moved into hotels.
2,800.
Oh, it's up to 2,800 now. Okay. And like I said, there are 515 on my block, and on 37th, there's another, I can't get the answers right if it's 1 or 2 hotels on 37th Street, but overall it's overwhelmed the capacity of the neighborhood to handle it. And unfortunately, as you know, the 30s has its share of problems, and the shelter residents aren't helping the situation. Many of them, I fear, are going to fall prey to a lot of the issues in our neighborhood if they're not already participating in them. But as residents in my building, many of which who have been there for 25 plus years, have all said, this is the worst our street has ever been. This is more dangerous than it was in the 90s. And many of us
Should have seen the 80s like I did.
Yeah, well,
We're right
yeah.
back in the 80s program.
Oh, it's
All right,
beyond, it's well before that. This is well beyond that. I mean, this, on 51st Street, we have 200, 2 doors for me, 200 people have been put into the WJ.
Yeah.
Without any telling anybody in the neighborhood.
Exactly.
It's appalling. If it's
We don't
any-
have leadership. We don't have political leadership. that
That's
look
not
out
it.
for
It's the
community.
mayor having too much fun with Hell's Kitchen. That's really what it boils down to.
But we have to have some clout. We need people in this neighborhood to represent us, the community. There's got to be some leadership. I don't just throw it up to the mayor. Something's missing here. There's a gap here.
Les, respectfully, we do have the representative who is chair of the health committee in Albany in the assembly, and I haven't heard anything from him either. So you're right. There is leadership missing.
But I mean, it's not for nothing. We do have the speaker of the city council who represents.
Yeah.
These contracts are being signed through emergency order, and it's not up to the speaker to review them. The mayor has emergency authority to do so. Currently, they're being signed month to month, but the expectation within City Hall, within the mayor's office, is that this goes into 2021. I believe the individual who is negotiating and signing these contracts is like the guy who ran against the mayor when the mayor ran for his second term in city council. Like they're chums. Like this is
I'm going to interrupt for just a
this is
second.
executive.
I want to remind us all that this is being recorded and transcribed, so we always want to be careful what we're saying. Nobody said anything to be worried about, but
With apologies, JD, I was late. Is what we're discussing one of the topics for tonight's meeting?
we have not started yet. We're about to
Okay,
start.
just checking.
Waiting for you, Dolores. So
Why, thank you.
I want to welcome,
Evening, everybody.
evening, everybody. I want to welcome everybody to this this meeting, our monthly meeting. I have to say a few words. I'm JD Noland. I'm the chair of the Hell's Kitchen Clinton Land Use Committee of Manhattan Community Board 4. As you all know, according to the executive order by the governor 202.1 or something like that, this is, it's going to be recorded, it's going to be transcribed. So, I don't know, Janine, if we have any member of the public calling in, we may or we may not.
Yeah, we have a few people.
There are two people. Welcome, everybody. The way we work is that we have our presentation. It's not much of a presentation. I'm really going to do the talking. And then the committee might have some questions to ask, some clarifying questions. And then we go to the public and make your comments or your questions. We welcome those, say whatever you want. And so I'm going to start the meeting very quickly. First of all, thank you all for coming, for attending this meeting. The basic thing we have to talk about, or we don't have to talk about, but what's on the agenda is the Western Rail Yards Infrastructure Project. They're doing, I think you all looked at that scoping video. It was about 17 minutes long. This is the EIS, the Environmental Impact Statement they have to go through. The Environmental Impact Statement looks at impacts on the built environment or the natural environment as they're building this structure. What is the structure? It's basically a platform over the Western Rail Yards. It's something like 9.8 acres. It's extraordinary. A platform of steel and concrete. That's the first thing. The second thing is a passageway for a potential future Trans-Hudson passenger rail line. So those are the two things. We have until July 31st, this July, to make comments. The public does too. It's very easy to make comments. You can write to them, or you can go online to www.westernrailyardsinfrastructure.com and make any comments you want. We can make comments tonight, or we can ask Jesse to write an administrative letter that we've discussed this, and these are our concerns if we have any. I'm sure we'll have concerns about the impact of construction on nearby residents. Sometimes we have Jesse works with a group to coordinate problems, to solve problems. Jesse can always write a letter about that if we want. If the public has questions, we can put those in a letter if the committee wants to, which we could present to the full board in July, at the end of July, I forget when it is. So that's basically what we're here tonight for. The platform over the Western Rail Yards so they can put up buildings. I don't know what we're worried about. Bob said the mole people who live there, we might be concerned about that. So you can raise those issues if you want to. That was a joke. You guys are a great audience, really. So are there anybody?
They're all on mute.
We're all on mute.
Okay, unmute. If you raise your hand if you want to comment, make questions, ask questions. Yes, Brian. Brian? Oh, I thought you raised your hand, Brian. No, okay. So if you have comments, you can always send them to me during the week. We can always get them in a letter if you're worried about that. I really don't know what to comment on this beyond the concerns about noise to the surrounding community. Anybody else?
Which is in the scope already.
Which is in the already, yeah.
Noise mitigation.
Janine, pardon me?
No, there's noise mitigation is in.
Okay. I was thinking if we want to set up a group of residents and the board to solve any problems that arise. Sometimes we do that. Janine, is anybody in the public would like to speak?
I don't see anything. If anybody wants to speak, please use the raise hand feature and then we'll call on you as you come up.
There was a mention in the chat room about road blocking for construction. So I don't know if there's anything that needs to be mentioned about that.
Yeah.
That was Mr. Kenneth.
Yeah, Kenneth.
Kenneth Castor.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's certainly going to be a lot of, I think we should, in the letter, that the administrative letter, we should raise concerns about the staging area and how that will impact on road access.
There's a question, JD, from Sinead Wadsworth. Is this project prevailing wage?
I think it actually asks if it's a union project.
Correct.
Well, no, the
Which I
question,
don't know.
the question is it prevailing wage? That's not union. There is
Well,
two. There are
They're
two.
two separate questions,
Two
both of
separate
them asked.
questions. One in the Q&A asks if it's prevailing wage. One in the chat asks if it's union. Those are two different issues, I think.
Same individual.
But is this committee also in the habit of asking constantly for local hiring on all projects? I mean, I think that's something we do across the board and everything. Is that in this already?
I think we can certainly ask anything we want to, Paul. The main thing is the impact on the environment, the built environment and the natural environment, archaeological or historical. But I think we can ask anything we want to ask and certainly throw it in. Also write to www.westernrailyardsinfrastructure.com with any concerns you have. Bob.
Normally, the scope doesn't cover those things, but as of now, my understanding is related in the unions, they're having an issue. They were suing each other, but they resolved their issues and are no longer suing each other and have an agreement through the building Congress and going forward on the Western Railroads.
Okay, that's good to know. But anybody want?
But I can't promise that'll be the case a year or so from now when.
James.
Yeah, I didn't see anything in there discussing, and maybe we've talked about it before, and if I'm forgetting, I apologize. What is intended to be built on top of this? And I know that's not specifically part of the scope, but it might be important in terms of how they're preparing this surface.
Well, it's the commercial residential park development that we've all agreed to. Nothing, as far as I know, about that has changed.
So my only concern, and I apologize that I didn't do a deep dive. If you were going to put a park in, then there's a lot of soil that's going on there, and then it's being watered, and then it needs to drain somewhere. That I would be concerned that, you know, if it's being optimized for structures, is it also able to handle a park?
Yeah, good point. I would hope so, but we certainly can put that in.
We can look. That should be in the scope. It's not really a park. It's like a green plaza, as I recall in the zoning. It's 80% residential and 20% commercial, and there's supposedly a school to go there.
Yeah.
In one part.
We can check it out, James.
And this will probably happen 16 years from now. So.
So if somebody want to make a motion to write an administrative letter to say that we've had a hearing and we're concerned about the staging area and the traffic, and we want to make sure there's good communication, something like that?
I'll make the motion to the sentiments of that suggestion.
I'll second.
Okay, thank you. Anything from the public, Janine?
No, nothing. No.
Okay, that's the end of that hearing. The only other item we need to talk about very briefly is that the Penn Station development, redevelopment, Empire Station Complex. It's mainly in Board 5 across 8th Avenue, 34th Street. Board 5 is having a joint committee meeting Monday, the 13th. Is it the 13th? Yes, at 6 p.m. We're welcome to join in that meeting. I think they want us to register. You contact Jesse. Paul, this has been traditionally, it's kind of Hell's Kitchen. There's a piece on the west of 8th Avenue that belongs to us, this redevelopment. We may want to be concerned about that.
There is.
And it affects, it's Hell's Kitchen, but it's close to Chelsea. So we may want to pay attention to that and kind of know what's going on. Paul, is your committee?
Yes.
Okay.
So, yeah, so there is one block on the south between 30th and 31st, which is clearly in Chelsea. And the transportation issues of Moynihan Station are of concern to the Transportation Committee. So we are actually going to do a joint meeting with Transportation and Chelsea Land Use on the 15th, which is when Transportation was already scheduled, because Chelsea Land Use would typically be scheduled on the 20th, but that's the night of the ESD hearing itself. So we wanted to have people be able to go to the 13th meeting for Community Board 5, have the opportunity for Community Board 4 to have a committee structure opinion on it, and then have people have the opportunity to attend the public hearing at ESD on the 20th. So Chelsea Land Use and Transportation Committees of CB4 will be holding a joint meeting on the 15th. So people can come to that.
And Bob, this was traditionally Hell's Kitchen because...
Yeah, the property is actually always considered a Hell's Kitchen, but it affects Chelsea. So Lee always was the person who went to the CB5 meetings on behalf of the committee.
So Paul, you'll keep us informed.
Yes.
Paul, you'll keep us informed on this committee about what's going on? Right.
Yes, 100%.
That's fine.
Okay. The only other thing, everything's been on pause, as you know, construction, but according to Jesse, things are going to gear up probably September, maybe October, where we're going to have a lot to deal with. So be prepared. It's my hope we don't have to have a meeting next month unless you all want one. I don't see any enthusiasm showing.
I'd be fine if, so long as there's some sort of email that goes out with a summary from Jesse.
Okay. Any other new business, old business? How do you all like Zoom?
Well, I just have one question because we were talking about it at the start of the meeting. There's obviously a lot of issues regarding the temporary moving of shelters into the hotels within our district. There are, of course, a lot of rumors flying around in the public amongst residents and neighbors and concerned that these temporary these hotels that are acting as temporary shelters will become permanent shelters. And the best I've been able to answer people regarding that is I think they would have to modify the zoning on that. I don't know if there's any answer here.
They don't.
They don't? They could just...
No, they don't. No, and it's something that was being considered when I was a policy director and council, was murmurs of potential ULURPs if a hotel was built and then its alternative purpose was to be a shelter, then it should go in front of a community board for vote and then go up through full city council. But that hasn't come to fruition yet. But that is something legislatively that could be done.
That's true, but a community board is to get notice if a place is going to become permanent.
I mean,
correct, but we're talking about an actual change of use from commercial to health and human services.
If the city went to put something permanent in the area, the community board would be notified. So
right, it would be notified, but there's also a legislative opportunity to change that and say, no, this has to go up in front of city council.
Oh, no, I'm agreeing. I'm just saying that even if they don't do that, we still would get notice ahead of time. It's not like we would wake up in the morning and all of a sudden there's
Well-
5 permanent.
Right,
Well,
which would look
again-
terrible in front of all the press because we'd be against the shelter and we'd be shocked, and it's just not something that like really works historically in the benefit of a community board. So this is why I'm saying there's a legislative option. It just needs to be considered and analyzed.
It's back to the 80s. It's back to the 80s, folks. Looks like. Anyway, thank you for that. Any other questions? New business, old business? I hope everybody's wearing a mask and taking care and keeping their spirits up in this really difficult. Yay, Paul. Welcome, David.
I have one follow-up question on the shelter issue.
Sure.
Is there anything in the statutes that indicates when something goes from temporary to permanent? Because, I mean, who makes that determination when it's triggered? Because you could say it's temporary and go month to month, but then 3 years later, it's like, oh, it's still month to month. But-
When the emergency order is lifted.
So from when the state lifts its emergency order?
The city, and yeah, essentially the state and the city would work hand in hand, but it's when the emergency order is lifted.
Okay, so if I understand you correctly, once the emergency order is lifted, then they would have to either remove people to permanent facilities or,
Let them go.
Correct.
okay,
But once again, if they want to make something into a permanent facility, all they have to do is give us a heads up, and they do it anyway.
But what does a heads up mean? Does that mean the public has an opportunity to weigh in and comment, or
No,
it's just
No, you just get
No.
notice.
you just get
Because-
notice.
because look, you know, that changed the entire demographic of my street alone, the whole neighborhood. I mean, you know, you're going to end up losing a lot of your current neighbors because
We've already lost,
Yeah, we just don't feel safe
you know,
walking out of our front
dozens of
door.
percentage points in
Mhm.
terms of residents and constituents in this area.
Brian, we've been abandoned by our electeds. That's as simple as that. It may be an emergency, but there's no excuse in an emergency not to handle this in a more systematic and logical way. What we're seeing is evidence of no planning in real time. And you cannot tell me that we don't have talented enough people in the city of New York to think about how ridiculous it is to move someone out of Queens or out of Brooklyn or out of Staten Island into Manhattan because they need to be in a hotel. This is silly for many reasons, but one of the things that's really going to be a problem for this community overall is as we are witnessing the quality of life issues here, even though this is temporary, when folks get moved back to their permanent shelters once the emergency is lifted, they've now made new contacts within our area, which means most of these folks will have a reason to come back. And we've now made our streets uncomfortable because there are folks here that may not be able to get access to services they need in order to help them not be frightening to other citizens. And as much as we are tolerant and we want to be helpful, there'll be more people who will just say no. And then we don't have solutions for these problems overall. I think what we all need to do, and again, this is not as maybe the community board, because the community board has been very vocal and written letters, but we need to continue to press upon the electeds that are there now to say they need to hear the voices of every single citizen that is impacting, from both the social services side, the folks that will not speak for themselves, not realizing what they do not have in this move, but for the folks that also are not living on safe streets, because some of our blocks really at this time are not safe.
Yeah.
Here.
Especially 9th Avenue at night, it's getting really rough. I go out late at night, and I moved here in '81, and it's '81 again, as JD said. And I used to live on 48th Street before JD did. But it seems to me that, and there's a lot of police cars down here. I don't want to approach the cops, but we have a new dealer, as you said, Dolores, who set up shop in front of the butcher shop on 9th Avenue between 44 and 45. I walk in the street. I got gloves on. I got a hat. It's whatever, a mask on. Just a little walking gun, and I'm a little frightened again.
Yeah. Paul at Poseidon's available for email. He's the owner of Poseidon Greek Bakery, and his email is available on his Instagram. It's actually Paul at PoseidonBakery.com. You can reach out to him anytime to discuss what's going on next door at that butcher shop, because he's just as concerned. He's actually decreased his hours and his exposure, and we can't have that.
Right.
Additionally, there are tons of cars, squad cars on 9th Avenue. On July 5th at around 1 a.m., there was a senior with dementia that I actually went over to a squad car over at the Duane Reade and found out his address and everything to get him away from there. He was actually looking for Sacred Heart at 1 a.m. Midtown North was able to get him a courtesy ride back to his home in Spanish Harlem. But these guys are busy with a lot of QL calls that we haven't seen in this volume in a generation. And it calls the question whether or not we as residents of the neighborhood, not as members of the community board, should be looking to actively be present safely in the streets to make sure that our NCOs in Midtown North and at other precincts are aware of where we are and what is going on.
I don't know how aware everyone on the board is, but, I know this Friday is a follow-up call that I will be on, I believe Maria Ortez and Joe Restuccia and Lowell with DHS and several of the shelter providers on West 36th Street and West 37th Street, and some commercial tenants and some residents in the neighborhood, because overnight that neighborhood transformed, and we are overwhelmed. Residents do not feel safe walking out their front doors. Commercial tenants don't feel safe reopening their businesses. And, we had one call with the shelter providers so far. I think maybe I might have joined on in the last call, but they were supposed to come back with comprehensive changes on this next call, and they haven't yet been implemented. We haven't seen any improvements on our street and our neighborhood. But I don't know, JD, you might reach out to Jesse and see if more members of the community are welcome on that call. Or, it was a big call last time. I think there were 30 participants on it. So if others are interested, I know that we're talking to the shelter providers in the 30s, but I know that a lot of people were referencing issues that were occurring all up 9th Avenue, all up 8th Avenue, and well into the 50s, and talking about what's worked with some of the shelters that have moved into our neighborhood and what's clearly not working with a number of the shelters that have moved into the neighborhood. But I think Dolores' point that you made a minute or two ago, Dolores, is very concerning, as you said, that we've now moved shelter residents who are in need of social services, who are in need of continued social services into a neighborhood that they are now making new connections. And in the 30s, it's new connections with drug dealers, unfortunately. And once, if this is a temporary measure and the shelters are moved out next month, if they're moved out 6 months from now, by that point, the groundwork has been laid, and this has become their community too. And what do we as a community do to curtail that? I don't know if it's something that land use has any opportunity to comment on, or if it's something that we continue hammering our electeds who are seeking higher office, and have them put pressure on DHS. Any solutions are welcome.
Thank you, Brian. James?
The frustration is palpable. I agree with everything Dolores and Chris and Brian are saying, and Morgan's concerns as well. I just want to mention that I'm also on HHSS. I've already composed a letter. You know, this isn't really, you know, within the purview of land use, in my estimation. JD, you're the final arbiter of that. But without a doubt, like, this is issue number one with HHS committee, and it should be number one on the full board's radar. And if there's anything I can do as a member of land use, or all of us can do, we should be channeling that energy to whatever that initiative is. But we need some sort of strong statement from the full board for immediate action by the electeds. And Chris, to your point, I understand that it's a executive issue, but at the same time, it doesn't mean that, you know, Corey's powerless.
It can be a legislative thing, which is what I had suggested. You know, like, we can say once these emergency orders end, anything permanent needs to go through a ULURP process, and it cannot just be a formal, like, hey, this is now permanent. No, it has to go through the full city council. It has to go through committee and et cetera.
Well, I want to take it a step further than that, and rather than wait for the legislative trigger, it's Corey's ability to take advantage of the bully pulpit that he has. Like, you know, even if he doesn't have any formal power, like, he can bring some influence there. And this
James, I would say that he is either powerless or he has chosen not to be vocal about this issue. His entire staff is working tirelessly on every single one of the issues on each of those blocks. We hear them at the meetings. They're here, they're active. I don't know that I've heard Corey's voice. So we either have to assume that he is powerless in this, or that he is choosing not to be proactive. And I'm saying that publicly and being on record because it is a problem. We have voiced at almost every committee, at police precinct council meetings, that we are in dire straits as a community. We've tipped the scales. This is very frightening. And I think that we are at the point of no return where we can feel comfortable in the way that we were 3 months ago within our district. And this is not a good thing.
I agree 100%, Dolores.
I'm just not in a position.
I want to say one thing. I have started a movement called Defund the Politicians. Defund the polls. I went to my block meeting last night and I ranted and raved. I'm madder than hell. And Brian, every block up here, every block association is going through the same thing. It is so frustrating. And I think we should express, the land use committee cannot write a letter, obviously, but each of us should go to our block meetings and just raise hell. And we should defund the polls. Defund the politicians. I said that at my block meeting. I know it sounds silly, but on the other hand, it's very upsetting. It's very upsetting. We have an issue with a resident right across the street, formerly homeless residents. They don't wear masks. They hang out, they don't wear masks. Simple thing. We've asked, okay, have them wear masks. We asked our representative. The answer was, well, we called and we asked them, we haven't heard back.
I've been
It's
told
simple
that
things like that. I'm
Yeah,
sorry,
I've
it's
been
simple
told-
things like that
Yeah,
our
sorry.
representatives can put a little pressure on to help us out. And I don't feel we're getting it up here. Anyway, it's very disheartening,
and quite honestly,
but at least we all agree.
Sorry, Zoom is awkward.
Go ahead, Brian.
Zoom is awkward. I mean, all the residents of my building sheltered in place for many months, and because of our proximity to the Javits Center, the hotels had been inhabited by the National Guard and health aid workers that were working at the Javits. And one day they moved out, the hotels were empty for a day, and then literally school bus load after school bus load of shelter residents came in, and like that, the neighborhood changed overnight. It's it's incredible. So I think that electeds really need to own the fact that this, and DHS needs to own the fact that this has had a grave impact. And until that happens, because when I go to these meetings and a lot of conversations, everyone brings up, well, there are all these other pre-existing issues, and there are all these other issues, pandemic and the economy, and all that is true, but noticeable change occurred when the shelters arrived on our street. And, you know, I think, you know, our street already is compassionate. Our neighborhood has existing supportive housing on our block. We have a needle exchange down the street. We have several methadone clinics within a 2-block radius. So we're aware of social services and the issues that they present. But this is at a whole other level. And it's heartbreaking that the city has done this and that the neighborhood has, as Dolores said, reached the point of no return in the span of like, it feels almost like a month. It's been surreal.
I agree, and I know from up here, there are people since the 1980s that have been working on block associations, on the community board to try to turn things around. And I just don't think they're gonna want to engage anymore once again when the city is letting them down. But
JD, you know, I think this speaks volumes about the failure of DHS right here in our doorstep. We've been talking about it time in and time out, that when we place people who are without home, and if they need health and human services, they should be provided health and human services, right? Regardless of whether or not there's an emergency. This should be something on DHS's mind the entire time. If these individuals who are contracted, these organizations that are contracted to serve our city's most vulnerable, they're doing them a disservice. And ipso facto, they're doing us a disservice because they deserve a right not only to be sheltered, but to return to society as sheltered and working people or functioning people in their own capacity. This is not anything against the homeless of New York City. This is 100% a failure of DHS.
JD,
Okay,
I appreciate that you've allowed the conversation to go to what's really important for the community, because the truth is this is what the community is concerned about right now. And obviously this land use issue is a non-event, but I think that for each of us on the call, and JD, if you don't mind, if I just make a suggestion, again, the board is voicing very, very strong opposition and trying to work with our electeds on a solution, but that seems to be failing. I would say that each of us individually needs to, as JD said, find our block associations. If there isn't one, form one. We need to create more voices that are all speaking to the same thing, because for some reason, our electeds seem to be unfocused on this concern that is literally creating havoc in Hell's Kitchen. I don't know if maybe because a little bit further south in Chelsea, they're not feeling this in the same way, but I know that there are probably other communities around the city that are experiencing the same thing. The concentration in our district is too high, and it's in a very, very small area within our district, and we're not getting that attention. So I know that personally, I'm going to put pressure on, not wearing the community board hat, but as a resident of 55th Street, to say that this is an issue, this is important, this is what I vote on, and also this is how we actually would like to help solve these bigger issues by providing the services that Chris was talking about and being supportive of them in any way that we can. But we can't have this concentration in our neighborhoods at the expense of the safety of all residents, including shelter residents and folks that are already in supportive housing in our community.
I want to ask, thank you, Dolores. I think it's an important issue because it is everybody's safety. It is a health issue, and it is a safety issue for all of us that walk on the street, for heaven's sakes. Bob, I want Bob Benfato. Bob, are you there? Did we lose Bob Benfato? Oh, there you are. Bob, can you hear me? There you are. Bob?
Yes. I
In
hear
your
you.
experience, when you when you were DM,
Yeah.
is there any way for the land use committee after this discussion to draft any kind of letter expressing some of these concerns, even though it's not primarily it's not a land use or zoning matter?
Yeah. You can.
And
Technically,
how
you can
would-
write on whatever you want to write on. The board could reject it by saying it was beyond your purview, but the committee could write on whatever it wants to.
So we could write.
I move we express some of these concerns about the buildings, the structures, and the land use of these areas that are now without social services for these new residents. I think that we can, it's a stretch to say it's land use, but I think that we've expressed enough concerns and issues here to write a letter to all of our electeds about how the reuse of the buildings in our area that don't allow for the social services that help these folks, that are creating unintended consequences for not just them, but also for the
You
residents.
can also tie it to the concern of will it become permanent as opposed to temporary, which could ultimately lead to a land use issue.
Okay.
Proactive.
I was going to make that suggestion too, that we actually.
Do we have a second on that before we have a discussion?
I hear an amendment from Paul.
We have to have
I'll
a
second
second.
I'll second it so I can make the discussion point I have on that too then.
Perfect.
So I second the motion, and I'd like to suggest that we include language, as Bob was talking about, that we make it a letter specifically about the ULURP process required to change a hotel from its usage of a hotel to a shelter. And that we want to notify the city in advance of when the emergency order is lifted, that this should go through a ULURP process, and this committee should be active in that decision process.
I agree.
I second that amendment.
And that allows you to go on and talk about the problems that are going on in the area.
Perfect.
Dolores, do you accept
I
that?
double second it. I double accept it.
Yeah, could I just add, I think that's great, because I think you're all underplaying, or some are understating that this is a land use issue. So I don't think anybody needs to be apologetic about this committee taking this on. It's land use. We're talking about a change of use.
Thank you,
I mean,
David. Yes, it is.
it's
It's
land
from
use.
health. It's from health to commercial hotel use, right off the
Yeah.
bat.
It's a land use issue. It doesn't mean it's only a land use issue, but it certainly is a land use issue.
Reuse of a building is a land use issue. We want to be notified when the emergency order is lifted that we are involved in any decisions on any of these hotels.
Yeah, that changed the use of a building.
And we want to see a vote. We want to see it through committee.
Yeah, Paul, could I ask, would it be maybe an idea first to ask what exactly is the procedure and have them get back to us in some way?
You'll wait 3 months for them to respond.
Yeah, the procedure
okay.
is rather simple.
I have a question. Does that tactically open up the door to, community board 4 is amenable to discussing turning these into permanent shelters? I mean, does that open up that?
Well,
Firmly,
depends.
no.
Depends how you word the letter, but I doubt JD's going to word the letter where it'll be clear that the
We'll have
community
JD
write
write
that.
the letter. We'll have JD write the letter. It'll be
I
written
wouldn't
right.
sweat that problem.
I think this is great, Paul. Ray, can you send me that language, Paul Devlin?
Sure.
I vote for it.
And anybody else want to add anything to the letter, please send it to me. And I'll send around a draft once I do it next week so we can have it for the full board. Dolores, did you have a comment?
No, I said I vote for it. And I just wanted to note that there was a comment in the chat saying that Chelsea is experiencing the same issues.
It's going on. It's around the city. It's in parts of Queens too. They've taken over all of Queens Boulevard in Queens and turned all the hotels there into temporary shelters. It's not
Queens
only
Boulevard, Long Island City.
It's a big problem all over the city. It's not just you.
Not showing up in
all
Brooklyn.
All in favor of the letter that was proposed and
Aye.
Added, amended? Anybody opposed to this letter? Frank, are you opposed?
No, you voted, I think you voted, I don't know.
You voted for it. Okay. Any present not eligible to speak? Thank you all. I'll get this letter out as soon as I can to you all. Any other issues? Good discussion. We're all in this together, it seems. All upset about it. Took so long. I think we could talk about this. Anyway, anybody want to make
As per your recommendation, 45th Street Block Association is having its meeting tomorrow evening. If anybody wants to go to that one.
Thank you, Paul.
Okay. Thank you, Paul.
Motion to adjourn?
Anybody want to make a motion to adjourn?
Dolores
Second
just
that
did.
motion.
Second.
Okay,
All
thank you.
right.
Goodbye, you all. Thank you all.
Thank you, Janine.
All right,
Be
bye, everyone.
safe.
Thank you.
Find joy. Love you all.
See you, everybody.
Thank you,
Bye,
Janine.
everyone.
All right, bye.
Bye-bye, you all.